God created this for man. Man created this for God. Community Christian Church, 1944 South Jackson Street, Frankfort, Indiana. Come, join us.
Heaven thundered, and the world was born. Life begins and ends in the dust you born. Faith commanded, and the mountains moved. Fear is losing ground to our hope in you. Unstoppable God, let your glory go on and on. Impossible things in your name, they shall be done. Freedom conquered, all our chains undone. Sin defeated, Jesus has overcome. Mercy triumph when the third day dawned. Darkness was denied when the stone was gone. Unstoppable God, let your glory go on and on. Impossible things in your name, they shall be done. Unstoppable God, let your glory go on and on. Impossible things in your name, they shall be done. Nothing's impossible. Nothing shall be impossible. Your kingdom reigns unstoppable. We'll shout your praise forevermore. Jesus our God unstoppable. Nothing shall be impossible. Your kingdom reigns unstoppable. We'll shout your praise forevermore. Jesus our God unstoppable. Nothing shall be impossible. Your kingdom reigns unstoppable. We'll shout your praise forevermore. Jesus our God unstoppable. Nothing shall be impossible. Your kingdom reigns unstoppable. We'll shout your praise forevermore. Jesus our God unstoppable. Unstoppable God, let your glory go on and on. Impossible things in your name, they shall be done. Unstoppable God, let your glory go on and on. Impossible things in your name, they shall be done. Open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Place in my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me. shall sing this clear, and by the way notes fall on my ear. Everything false will disappear. Silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my ears, illumine me. Spirit divine, open my mouth and let me bear gladly the warm truth everywhere. Open my heart and let me prepare love with thy children thus to share. Silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my heart, illumine me. Spirit divine, open my mind that I may read more of thy love in word and deed. What shall I fear while yet thou dost lead? Only for life from thee I plead. Silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my mind, illumine me. Spirit divine, open my eyes, illumine me. Spirit divine. You may be seated.
Hey, we are in week number 5. That's kind of hard to believe in this series entitled Big Questions. And throughout this series, we've been looking at questions that maybe we've wanted to ask, maybe we've felt like we need to ask, but we've been scared to ask. Does the Bible condone slavery and racism? I mean, you can make a case, yeah, it sure does. And you can make a case and say no. You know, you could say, is faith irrational? Well, there's a part of you that goes, yeah, it's irrational. That's why it's faith. But Jesus also said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's not just irrational. There's some rational component to it. We talked about, is Christianity intolerant of other faiths? And we see that Jesus interacted with people from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And he didn't stand there and say, you pagans, I can't believe you. What did he do? He'd sit with sinners. He'd sit with people that everybody else said, stay away from. A Roman centurion comes to him, a Roman guard, a Samaritan woman, that half-breed, second-class, lower-class woman. And that's not me speaking, that's culturally to the Jews. Jesus sat down with her at a well. We treat people with love and respect. Then last week we talked about, is the Bible anti-women? Some people say, yeah, it sure is. But when we look at the Bible and we see all of the great women leaders, we can say, nah, I don't think it is. And we have to I always say this, we read things in context. Paul's letters to the churches were written to a specific group of people at a specific time in a specific place. We remember that, or at least we should. Today, we're looking at a really important topic that I want to talk about. And the good news for you is that I have a head cold. I can't hear. And so I think Mike earlier, and I said, I'm going to try to keep it under 45 minutes. He said, good luck. And I said, no, that good luck is for you guys. But there was a guy named James Missioner. And James Michener was one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century. And when he was a very, very old man and had suffered a great deal in his life, he wrote his memoirs. And he started by remembering an event from his childhood. He wrote this: "The farmer living at the end of our land had an aging apple tree that had once been abundantly productive, but had now lost its energy and its ability to bear any fruit at all. The farmer, on an early spring day, I still remember, hammered 8 nails, long and rusty, into the trunk of the tree. 4 were knocked in close to the ground on 4 different sides of the trunk, and 4 higher up and well spaced about the circumference." He continues, says, that autumn a miracle happened. That tired old tree, having been goaded back to life, produced a bumper crop of juicy red apples, bigger and better than we had seen before. And when I asked him how this had happened, the farmer explained, well, hammering in the rusty nails gave it a shock to remind it that its job is to produce apples. So I said, well, was it important that the nails were rusty? Well, maybe it made the mineral in the nail easier to digest. Well, was 8 nails important? Well, if you're going to send a message, be sure it's heard. Well, could you do the same next year? And the farmer said, well, a substantial jolt lasts about 10 years. Today we're talking about pain. And pain is nails hammered into a tree, and the nails of life always come, don't they? The book of Job says, for hardship doesn't spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground, yet man is born to trouble, as surely as sparks fly upward. See, we want to believe that the nails, the pain, the suffering that's oftentimes hammered into our lives, both yours and mine, will somehow make us more fruitful. It will make us more productive. But what we know for sure, all we know for sure, is that trouble comes. You hear about a man who's diagnosed with terminal cancer. I read about this recently. And his brother agreed to care for him while his body wasted away. And then, very unexpectedly, his brother, the caregiver, his caretaker, died suddenly from a heart attack. And so that man at the funeral of his brother, the clothes just hanging from his body like a scarecrow, is burying the brother that he thought was going to bury him. A wonderful young boy grows up in a church, but he's different. His patterns of attraction are different, and he's made fun of, and he's taunted, and he's not wanted, even in church. And what should have been the safest place for him to be was actually the most dangerous place for him to be. And it may have been a long time ago, but the wounds still fester. You know, I think sometimes if there was such a thing as a pain-ometer, if it were possible to measure units of pain like we measure the depths of the ocean, how large would the sea of human sorrows actually be? This also is from the book of Job. If only my grief could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. And then he says later on, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. That's an amazing statement from Job, isn't it? You know, like God is shooting poisonous arrows at him. And that's just one life. How many of you all remember in 2004 the earthquake that was under the Indian Ocean? And it unleashed an amount of energy equivalent to 550 million times the energy of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And 250,000 people were killed by the ensuing tsunami. Anybody remember that? Every one of them was somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's friend, somebody's father, mother. And they all had hopes and dreams. And it's interesting, in the days and weeks that followed, newspapers and conversation forums were filled with the question we think about this weekend: is it possible to believe in a God who is all-loving, so much so that he wants what is good, and is also all-powerful, so he's also able to make what is good? Is it possible to believe in that all-loving, all-powerful God in a world with so much suffering and so much evil? That may be a question that you've asked, at least in your head, and been afraid to ask in the church. Maybe it's a question you've been asked and you feel very sympathetic towards the person asking, or maybe it's a question you've been asked and said, "Pagan, I can't believe you had asked that question." But it's a good question. And it's a big question. Archibald MacLeish wrote a play about Job where he expressed this problem in a single line that maybe you've heard. If God is good, he is not God. If God is God, he is not good. And it's striking that one of the books that is most troubled and most perplexed by human suffering is this book that we say contains all the answers to all of life's problems, the Bible. The Bible has an awful lot to say about suffering. Really, the first 2 chapters in the Bible are about the universe before suffering, and the last is about existence post-suffering. But almost everything else in between is all about suffering. Because it's about life. It's about a people living life. Sometimes, maybe most of the time, we bring suffering on ourselves. We readily admit that. It's a consequence of our actions. Show of hands on this one, please. Audience participation. How many people have ever gotten a speeding ticket? All right. Me too. I'm right there with you. Second question, how many of you were actually speeding when you got the ticket? Should be the same number of hands. I got a ticket one time when Susan and I were dating. We were in college. I was preaching some weekends, about 1 weekend a month at a church in South Carolina, and we'd go down and we'd stay with the family in the church, and she and I were driving to South Carolina one weekend, and a police officer pulled me over outside of Columbia, South Carolina. He pulled me over, he grilled me, he asked me to step out of the car, and I'm like, "For speeding? Are you serious?" I had actually happened to stop right next to a speed limit sign. So this very kind, compassionate, understanding state trooper in South Carolina got me out of the car and actually made me read the speed limit sign to him. That's just the beginning of my experience with state troopers. And he ultimately gave me a ticket for less than what I apparently was doing. And he said to me, out of every 100 cars on this road today, 99 of them are speeding. And you know what? My first thought was, why me? Seriously. There are 98 other cars out there speeding. Why me? Other people are way worse drivers than me. But the answer, of course, to that why me was, I was speeding. See, in the Bible, there are places like the book of Proverbs that offer wisdom about this. Drive wisely, parent wisely, handle your money wisely, your sexuality, your anger, your words. Don't blame God, don't blame the universe or other people if you've made your own mess. But here's the thing, we all do, don't we? And we all need that wisdom. And yet there are way more passages. There are way more passages in the Bible that wrestle with not the certainty of suffering and the consequences of our own mess, but it deals with the mystery of suffering. Because here's the thing, mostly the biblical writers, they don't explain suffering to people. Mostly they protest suffering to God. From the book of Exodus with Israel's slavery in Egypt, to the suffering of Job, to the emptiness of the writer of Ecclesiastes, to psalms of complaint to God, to entire books like Lamentations. Jeremiah is a completely depressing book of the Bible. These questions, how long, what for, why, God, have you forgotten? Do you hear, will you act? It's fascinating. The Bible is not mostly written by people who explain evil and prove God's existence. It's written by people who are disoriented, who are overwhelmed, who are troubled by evil, just like you and me. You know what? I hate evil and suffering and hurt. I hate that people that I love have to carry burdens that crush them, burdens that are unfair or unrelenting. Sometimes you can wake up at night, troubled by that fact. And we can think of others who suffer way worse than I do. And I'm oftentimes chastened by that, corrected by it. And I'm reminded, though, that we all must still just find a way to live. We all must find a why to live. Not just a way to live, but a why to live. And all of us, Christian, atheist, Buddhist, Muslim, skeptic, none of the above, all of us are united in fellowship of grief and hurt and pain because that's life. It's the strangest thing. If you ask people why they don't believe in God, the existence of pain and evil and suffering is probably one of the number one answers that they'll give. And yet, and there's a writer named Barbara Brown Taylor who's written some great books. She talks about this. She says that most religions are actually born out of suffering. For example, a very young entitled prince named Siddhartha leaves his palace, sees a sick man and an old man and a dead body for the first time in his life, and decides to devote himself to the problem of suffering, and thus Buddhism begins. The story at the center of Israel is an exodus out of Egypt when the people of Israel are enslaved, and they didn't know why, and their children are being murdered. Christianity begins with the life of Jesus, who wasn't born in a palace. He was born impoverished and hounded during his ministry. And the Gospels are unique among biographies in focusing mostly on his humiliation and crucifixion. You know, sometimes the Gospels are called the death story with an introduction. The prophet Isaiah says about the Messiah, he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. But our outrage at unjust suffering actually points toward the existence of God. There's an Oxford professor that maybe you've heard of, a guy by the name of C.S. Lewis, who wrote how, for many years, his main reason for being an atheist was that the universe was so cruel and so unjust and so unfair. But over time, he came to realize that if atheism was true, there would be no grounds for this complaint, because there would be no reason to expect justice in the first place. So C.S. Lewis writes this. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please me." And he said this, he says, "Atheism just turned out to be too simple for me." See, deep down, here's the thing. I think deep down we know that there is such a thing as justice. There is such a thing as fairness, and it's not arbitrary. You know, we're rightly angered when justice is violated, and we demand justice. I read years ago about a guy named Dave Hegler. Dave is the program director for the Los Angeles Sports and Law chapter, and he also works as an umpire at baseball, softball games. And he told this story. He said, "I was driving too fast in the snow in Boulder, Colorado, and a policeman pulled me over and gave me a speeding ticket." You know, we've all been there, right? I tried to talk him out of it, telling him how worried I was about insurance and that I was normally a very careful driver, like we all are. And he said I should go to court and I should try to get it reduced or even thrown out. And the first game of the next baseball season, it was an adult baseball league, the first game of the next baseball season, I'm umpiring behind home plate, and the first batter up in the game is that same policeman. I recognize him. He recognizes me. He asks me how the thing went with the ticket, and I just very simply tell him, "Swing at everything." Maybe there is such a thing as justice. But where does justice originate? Where does justice come from? See, the whole notion of justice presupposes, it demands that existence is more than just a universe full of a bunch of atoms rearranging themselves. There's not just a way things are, there is a way things should be. Evolution is simply about the survival of the fittest, but that's not enough to explain moral reality. It explains a lot, but not that. Innocent people shouldn't starve. They shouldn't be oppressed. They shouldn't be abused. And now, none of this proves that there is a God. But it does show that our outrage at unjust suffering is actually a hard thing for secularism to account for. You know, sometimes secularism offers the illusion of control. And it's kind of ironic, because of medicine and technology and wealth, we've reduced many forms of suffering in our day. We live longer, we live healthier, we live cleaner, safer, more educated, more affluent lives, at least here, right? But that very progress often feeds the illusion that we're in control. Often we want to make sense of suffering because we think that if we can make sense of it, then we can avoid it, we can control it. If people hear about somebody contracting lung cancer, very often what's their first question? Do they smoke? Because I can't smoke, therefore it won't happen to me. And we know that's not true. I can parent better, and then my kids are going to turn out the way that I want them to, right? I can work harder, and then I'm not going to suffer any vocational pain. I can adopt a healthy lifestyle, and then I won't lose my health, right? Ironically, we suffer way less than people in the ancient world did, but we fear suffering way more than they did. In the ancient world, by contrast, part of wisdom was to cultivate awareness that suffering is inevitable. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, I hope I pronounced that right, he said that you should constantly remind yourself and those nearest to you of your own vulnerability and your own mortality. And so he said one time, "What harm is there while you are kissing your child to murmur softly to them, 'Tomorrow you will die'?" By the way, Epictetus's kids all ended up in therapy. See, in the ancient world, though, they knew about suffering. In medieval Europe, 20% of all children did not reach their first birthday. 50% of all children died before their 10th birthday. And people in that day, they loved their kids just as much as we love ours. The average lifespan at that time in the world was about 35 years old. I'd be dead for almost 10 years now. They had a worldview that could make sense of suffering far better than most people in our day, because we think that we can control it, or we can use technology or legislation to outlaw suffering. One of the greatest questions you and I have to ask of any worldview is, what does it have to say to a suffering individual? Biologist and atheist, famous individual Richard Dawkins describes the message of secularism like this. He says, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice." And there's truth to that, isn't there? Some people, man, it just stinks. But I'm struggling with the idea of, the first church that we worked at, there was a young girl, Amanda, who would come to our youth group sometimes with friends. She would participate in activities. And this young girl, teenager, died of cancer. And I can't imagine sitting at the side of her bed and saying, "Well, you know what? Some people get lucky. I guess you just didn't. No rhyme, no reason, no justice, no hope." See, I believe that justice is... I believe that despair is not just bad, it's not just unpleasant. I believe that it's wrong. It's incorrect. Despair is false. It's based on a false look at the world, because there's a strange thing about suffering. Suffering sometimes points us beyond ourselves. We often try to numb our pain with work or shopping or comfort foods. That's an interesting language. Or a forbidden website, or a few drinks. But every addiction begins as an escape from pain. Every one of them, and also every addiction ends with enslavement to pain. Every one of them. But we try to hide our pain, avoid our pain. There was a famous story back in the day in the Manual of Psychological Medicine that was first published around 1850. There was an Italian actor who went to see a doctor about a depression that he was suffering from, that he despaired of ever being cured. And the doctor recommended that he go see the acting of a famous comic of that day named Carlini. And the doctor said, "Your depression would have to be very deep indeed if the acting of the fabulous Carlini does not remove it." And the patient sighed and very quietly said, "I am Carlini." There's an author named Lewis Smedes who said that we can distinguish between two primary ways of suffering. And this is where suffering and hope begin to intersect. Smedes used to say that there's suffering from and there's suffering with. See, we can suffer from something, we can suffer with someone. We suffer from painful events and experiences and losses, large and small. Loss of sleep or bad traffic or bad hair days or divorce or bankruptcy or cancer. And when you're experiencing something you very much want not to be experiencing, you're suffering from. But Smedes says there's also suffering with. And that's, oddly enough, something that people choose. It's voluntary suffering. We stop what we're doing and sometimes we sit beside a hospital bed. We listen to a mom who's lost her child, or we bring a meal to somebody who's lost a parent. Somehow we sit with our children in their most anxiety-filled moments. And I know I can't fix it, and I can't make pain go away. I can do nothing but hurt with them. Those pains of taking your child to an ER and when they're having breathing problems. I can't fix it. I can't take it away. I just sit there with them. And I can do nothing but hurt with them. Yet my willingness to hurt with them maybe somehow helps them. They're less alone. And part of their burden is somehow shifted to me. And there's a bond and a connection that's deeper than it was before. See, suffering can hurt every bit. Suffering with can hurt every bit as much as suffering from. But it often involves a breathtaking kind of goodness and nobility within us. And it brings us to the heart of the story of a guy named Jesus. See, Jesus was the master of suffering with. There's never been anybody who did this like Jesus ever. He suffered with lepers and gave them hope. He wept over lost peoples. He listened to the scandal-ridden. He had compassion on the doubters. He suffered rejection and mockery and humiliation on behalf of all mankind to show us hope and to show us forgiveness and to show us love. And the place of his ultimate suffering was the cross, suffering from, but also suffering with. And sometimes we wonder in our pain and our suffering, where is God in all of it? But he's there on a cross, nails pounded into a tree, but first pounded into the hands of God. And only Jesus reveals to us what no human being had ever imagined before him. A wounded God, a broken God, a loving God, a scarred God. John Stott wrote a book about the cross of Jesus, and he says this. He says, "I've entered many Buddhist temples, and I've stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, with the ghost of a smile on his face. But each time I turn away again to the lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, plunged in God-forsaken darkness, all to show us what love is about." That is the God for me. Because he entered our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. And there's still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross that symbolizes divine suffering where we experience love. Isaiah again said about the Messiah, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. You see, we don't honor life. We don't honor those that we love. We don't honor the courage of so many who have borne loss nobly before us by capitulating to despair. And so what do a lot of times? We fight. Jesus didn't tell us that we will not suffer. He says that we will not suffer alone. There was a time when the disciple Thomas said that he couldn't believe that Jesus had really been raised from the dead, and Jesus appears to him and says, "Put your fingers there. See my hands." And this is amazing because sometimes we don't think about this. In other words, Jesus has a new resurrected body, and if I'm getting a resurrected body, I don't want that bald spot. I don't want the scar right here from falling off my bike. I don't want the wart that's growing on my elbow. I want a resurrected body, a new body. But Jesus has this new resurrection body, and it's real, and he's able to eat, and he's able to do remarkable things like pass through a locked door. But in his resurrected body, I love this, he still carries scars of those nails. And God says one day he's going to wipe away every tear, but Jesus still carries his scars. And the early followers of Jesus were staggered by this, and they wrote that maybe Jesus retained his scars not because he couldn't heal them, but because those scars reflect his love. They reflect his love more than unwounded hands ever could. Paul says that Jesus knew unimaginable glory and that through him the stars in the skies were made. And I think often we want to turn our scars into stars, but Jesus turned those stars into scars. And who would make up a story like that? And all of that points to our calling. And this may be a so what, and you can write this down. I didn't leave a spot for it. Why you and I are here now as a church. Paul says this. He says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. And now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, in order that we may be glorified with him. They're suffering from, but they're suffering with. And, in our lives, I'll admit, my life's pretty good. I got 3 healthy boys for the most part. There's very minimal suffering in my life compared to so many others. We're called to suffer with. So how do we suffer with somebody who lived and died 2,000 years ago? Well, Jesus told us how. I think he said this in a parable. He said, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. See, Jesus points to human suffering, to suffering human beings, every one of them, and he says, I'm there, and I'm there, and I'm there. I weep, I bleed, I hurt, I die. And when we mourn with those who mourn, and when we listen, and we can all do this, when we sit beside someone who's sick, when we spend time and energy to come alongside somebody who doesn't have a home, or when we visit an injured veteran at the VA, or when we sponsor and take the time to write to a little child, or when we do something to alleviate suffering here, there, everywhere. When we give, maybe even give sacrificially to those in extreme poverty, we are suffering with Jesus. And it's not something that we suffer with and go, thank goodness I suffered today. It's an honor. And so you don't have to go out bragging about it, do you? You just say it was an honor to suffer today. And our suffering is not in vain. See, a deep need for suffering people is that good can come out of their suffering. Not so much that it can be explained, but so that it can be redeemed. I've gotten to the point where I do a lot of funerals. I did a funeral last weekend for a young woman, 32 years old, died unexpectedly. What do you say to her family, to her 2 little children? You just say, sometimes life sucks. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I say it's foolish of me it'd be foolish of me as a pastor, as a minister of the gospel, to stand up here and explain away all of these things and say, everything happens for a reason, praise Jesus. Because right now you just hurt. And you don't need an explanation. I think of people I've known over the years, a parent who loses a child to a drug overdose. Oftentimes they want to help other parents. A mom who loses a child to a drunk driver starts an organization to fight drunk driving. A man who loses his leg in an accident ends up devoting his life to helping quadriplegics. The movement of Jesus got started by 2 moments. Ultimate suffering in the crucifixion, and then ultimate hope in the resurrection. How can our suffering be redeemed? How can the suffering of others be redeemed? See, Jesus and then those who followed him endured suffering in a way previously unknown to humanity because they had a hope that was previously unknown to humanity. When Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he put it like this. He said, therefore we don't lose heart, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Man, those are amazing words by a man who knew suffering. Paul had been shipwrecked and flogged and stoned and imprisoned and persecuted and starved and impoverished. And he was told that it was coming, because as we talked about a couple weeks ago, we talked about, God calling Saul. He said, I'm going to show him how much he's going to have to suffer for my name. And Paul was ultimately martyred. Yet he calls all of those troubles light and momentary. Are you kidding me? Nails pounded in a tree. And what he's saying is, you put them all on a scale, every tear shed by every broken heart, and then on the other side of the scale, you set a radiant, unending, eternal goodness that we can't yet see. But Jesus can and promises is coming, and Paul calls that eternal glory. So is the glory then worth the trouble now? Is the hope that we have that big? The best I can offer is not nearly an adequate picture. It's just the best I can do right now. John Ortberg tells about the birth of their first daughter. And he says this. He says, our first daughter was born after 12 hours of terribly excruciating labor. And she was, he says, in quotes, sunny side up, I think is the technical medical term, which meant that the hardest part of her head was pressing against my wife's spine. At one point, the doctor reached into my wife's body and wrenched Laura around 180 degrees, and Nancy yelled. He said, I'd been instructed in Lamaze never to use the word pain. So I said to Nancy, are you experiencing discomfort? He says, that didn't help much at all. He said they had to suction that little body out of my wife so that when Laura came out, her head was way misshapen. And I thought if she could have spoken during those 12 hours or in that first second when she came into this world, she would have said to me, why did you do this to me? Why? And I would have tried to tell her, he said, oh, my child, I know it's awful. I know. And he said this, but now it's been 33 years later, and she's known the glory of being alive. She got to learn how to walk and talk and read and write and made friends and found a vocation and fell in love and had a child of her own. And her life has now been about 22,000 times longer than it was for those 12 hours. And she could not and did not know then the life that lay before her. And he says the gap between a little baby and an adult is nothing next to the gap between a finite human being and an infinite God. But here's the thing, it's not just that. Tim Keller writes about a wonderful line J.R.R. Tolkien had in The Lord of the Rings right at the end. Sam Gamgee sees Gandalf and he says, I thought you were dead. But then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Yes, it is. It's not just that suffering's going to end. It will eventually. It'll be healed, it'll be reversed, it'll be redeemed, it'll be undone. Everything sad is going to come untrue. C.S. Lewis had a wonderful line as well. One time he wrote that heaven will work backwards. So many times we pray that God's kingdom's going to come, God's kingdom's going to come. God's kingdom is already here, friends. It came with Jesus. Heaven has already turned the cross, which was the ultimate instrument of violent hate and injustice, into the ultimate expression of triumphant love. And it will one day turn agony, every agony, your agony, my agony, into glory, endless glory, unimaginable glory. And so in the meantime, man, life stinks. And we will suffer, but we suffer with as well. We mourn with those who mourn. We come alongside. We love the people around you like your family. I hope that you have I know that a lot of you all come from this area, and you're from here, and you may have family close by, and that's great. But I hope that you have a circle of people around you who love you and who are going to be with you when you suffer in the same way that you can be with them when they suffer. Nails pounding into a tree to produce life. That's the story of our world, but hope is coming. And being part of the church means that we all have people that we need to suffer with. And I hope that you have that. And I want to encourage every single one of you to find a little group like that. If you need to pray, pray. If you need to persist, persist. Because we know that suffering will come. But I hope that it will never find you alone. God, I thank you that we are not alone. That you give us hope through your Son, Jesus. And I pray that in this life that we would be, because we are blessed and with resources, with so many wonderful things, I pray, God, that we would use those to suffer with people, to help alleviate suffering wherever we can throughout this world. That we would come alongside people and love them, no matter where they are, no matter where they come from. That, God, we would be a part of your reconciliation, redeeming suffering, bringing good into this world. God, thank you that you love us. But God, let us never, ever, ever be selfish with that love. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I don't know about you. I'm selfish. I am. It's easier to want someone to suffer with me than it is to want to suffer with someone. Just because we don't, it's always nice to have somebody alongside me. It's nice to have somebody alongside me. But am I willing to do the same? Am I willing to help alleviate Mike's suffering, or Mason, or Riley, or am I? And it doesn't just have to be the people that are right here. God has an amazing way of bringing the world to us. And we're called to alleviate suffering wherever we can, to help, to love, to comfort, to console. But it takes surrender on our part. It takes me saying, God, it's not about me, it's about you. And it's about loving you and sharing and showing your love. And so I have to surrender to him each and every day and say, God, here I am, use me. Take me, use me for your glory, so that other people might know you because of you working in my life today. This morning, as we conclude, we're going to sing, Here's My Heart, Lord. If there's some decision that you need to make, surrender to him today, would you come as we stand and sing?
Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true.
Let's sing that again.
Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. As I am bound, I am yours. I am loved. I'm made pure. I have life. I can breathe. I am healed. I am free. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. 'Cause I am bound, I am
have life, I can breathe, I am healed, I am free. You are strong, you are sure, you are life, you endure. You are good, you're always true. You are light breaking through. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. Speak what is true. I am found, I am yours, I am loved, I'm made pure, I have life, I can breathe, I am healed, I am free. You are strong, you are sure, you are life, you endure. You are good, you're always true. You are light breaking through, and you are more than enough. You are here and you are love. You are hope, you are grace. You're all I have, you're everything. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. Speak what is true. Speak what is true.
Community Christian Church, 1944 South Jackson Street, Frankfort, Indiana.